My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Ramesses the Great did not build for the present, rather the next 3,000 years. In an era where a pharaoh's legitimacy was tied to his divinity and his military accomplishments, this temple was his ultimate justification. It was a physical manifestation of his authority and a calculated piece of propaganda designed to ensure that, even in death, his name would never be erased from the earth. At the start of the 13th century BC, Egypt was at a crossroads. The turmoil of the Amarna period, the heretic revolution of Akhenaten, was a fading but bitter memory. The 19th dynasty, led by Ramesses' father, Seti I, had spent decades restoring stability across the kingdom and the Levant. When Ramesses II took the throne in 1279 BC, he wanted to be the definitive symbol of Egyptian restoration. Known to his people during his reign as the House of a Million Years, the Ramesseum was his mortuary temple. Situated on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, it was commissioned to anchor Ramesses' legacy in the sacred landscape of the dead. Construction began almost immediately upon his accession. It took 20 years to complete, and as we look at the ruins today, we see the remnants of a structure that was meant to reflect the perfection of the primordial world, a world where the pharaoh was the bridge between the chaotic earth and the eternal gods. The Ramesseum is a masterpiece of conventional architecture and symbolism. Entering through the monumental pylons, which are specifically in Egyptian terms the tapered towers representing the horizon, the visitor would have been struck by the sheer scale. These pylons were the archet, the cosmic boundary where the sun god Ra rises and sets. But the true centre of this propaganda was the first courtyard. Here stood the Colossus of Ramesses. A red granite monolith, it stood nearly 20 metres tall and weighed a staggering 1,000 tonnes. Transported 270 kilometres from the quarries of Aswan, it was the largest moved statue in the ancient world. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, recorded the inscription at its base: "King of kings am I, Ramesses. If anyone would know how great I am and where I lie, let him surpass one of my works." Just as Augustus was depicted in the Prima Porta to appear more composed and young, Ramesses used these statues to project an image of a smiling, calm, and eternal protector. But the most revealing details of his propaganda aren't found in the statues, but in the reliefs on the walls. If you walk into the second courtyard, you are met with the Battle of Kadesh. This was the defining military event of Ramesses' reign, a clash between Egypt and the Hittite Empire in 1274 BC. On the walls of the Ramesseum, the narrative is extremely clear. Ramesses, deserted by his troops and surrounded by over 2,000 Hittite chariots, calls upon the god Amun to defeat the entire enemy army single-handedly, a cinematic and heroic victory. But as historians, we have to look at the original sketch beneath the paint, so to speak. The reality was a bloody stalemate. Ramesses failed to capture the city of Kadesh. His tactical victory was actually a narrow escape from a Hittite ambush. Yet, 16 years later, this stalemate resulted in the first recorded peace treaty in history. This was signed in the Akkadian language of the Persian regions, at the time the universal language of diplomacy. In the Ramesseum, however, this treaty is secondary to the myth. The Hittites are depicted with partially shaved heads and disorganised formations. Portrayed as chaotic and uncivilised, the natural enemies of Ma'at, or divine order. By rewriting a military draw as a divine triumph, Ramesses justifies his role as the guardian of Egypt. The Ramesseum was actually a thriving industrial hub on top of its religious and royal shell. Surrounding the stone sanctuary was a vast utility area of mud brick buildings. This was the House of a Million Years in action. There were workshops and offices, breweries, and over 30 bakeries. Fire pits still visible in the ground today, some from the Roman period, a reflection of a site that fed thousands. It was also a centre of intellect. A cache of papyri found on site indicates that the temple served as a scribal school. This grounds the god king in a very human reality. While the inner sanctuary was private, reserved only for the king and his high priest to discuss the political and the divine, the outer courtyards were open to the public. This is where the propaganda met the people. They saw the giant statues, they read the epic poems of his victory at Kadesh, and they felt the weight of a stable and prosperous empire. One of the most critical aspects of the Ramesseum's propaganda is its king list. Inside, Ramesses depicts the procession of past pharaohs, honouring his ancestors to prove his legitimacy. But as a student of this period, the omissions are more striking than the inclusions. The heretic Amarna pharaohs, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, the female pharaoh Hatshepsut are nowhere to be found. By erasing them from his temple walls, Ramesses was erasing them from history itself, an extremely common practice in ancient Egypt and the shift of dynasties after turbulent times. He was selecting his lineage, crafting a narrative of unbroken, proper rule that led directly to him, a blatant act of historical revisionism. The temple was constructed primarily of sandstone, a material chosen for its eternal quality, and its layout follows the classical New Kingdom mortuary style, a series of ascending courtyards leading to the darkened private sanctuary of the gods. The most striking feature is the Great Hypostyle Hall, which originally boasted 48 massive columns. The 12 central columns represent the 12 months, whilst the surrounding 36 reflect the deacons, the stars used to divide the Egyptian sky. On the ceiling above, vibrant astronomical charts link to Pharaoh's reign directly to the movements of the cosmos, and therefore to the gods. But in my opinion, the most potent symbolism is found on the Osiride pillars. Here, Ramesses is depicted not as a man, but linked to Ra and then Osiris, the god of the dead, standing mummiform with his arms crossed. Nearby reliefs show the bark of Amun, the divine solar boat. By carving his image into these icons, Ramesses was ensuring his transfiguration. Ramesses II lived to be 90 years old, outliving many of his wives and dozens of his alleged 100 children. By the time he died in 1213 BC, he had ruled for 67 years. The Ramesseum was meant to be his eternal home, but history had other plans. Just a few generations after his death, the Bronze Age collapse, which I will be covering in my next video, would sweep across the Mediterranean, ending Egypt's imperial golden age. The great Colossus would fall, and the name Ramesses would be corrupted by the Greeks into Ozymandias. Yet, we need to ask the question, did this propaganda fail? Well, we're still here 3,000 years later, discussing his battles, his architecture, and his legacy. He wanted to be remembered as the great builder, the great conqueror, and despite the erosion of time and the collapse of empires, he may well have succeeded. Ramesses the Great, the man who made himself immortal. I've been Diadochi, and thank you so much for watching.